Thank you very much for waiting, everyone. Now the plenary session 2, Energy Transition, Leaving Nobody Behind, shall commence. First of all, I'd like to introduce 3 moderators for the session. Mr. John Moore, Dr. Hossein Lee, and Mr. Vikram Mehta. Mr. Moore is an ICEF Steering Committee member and Chief Executive Officer at the Bloomberg NEF. And Dr. Lee is also an ICEF Steering Committee member, Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on the Climate Change, and Endowed Chair Professor at the Graduate School of Energy and Environmental in Korea University. Mr. Mehta is also an ICEF Steering Committee member and chairman of the Center for Social and Economic Progress Research Foundation. So now I'd like to ask Mr. Moore, Dr. Lee, and Mr. Mehta to moderate the session. So Mr. Moore, Dr. Lee, and Mr. Mehta, if you please.
Thank you very much. And first off, thank you very much for joining us. It's a very, very important topic, the energy transition, leaving nobody behind. So I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. It's actually quite a complicated topic. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how we get the different perspectives from our panelists. So I'm joined actually on stage by Nan Wang, who is Vice President of Sustainable Business Division at MUFG Bank Limited. Online, we have Rob Macquarie, who's a policy analyst and research advisor to Professor Stern at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, which is connected to the LSE. Next to him is Shalu Agarwal, who is a senior program lead for Environment and Water at CU, which is the Council on Energy, Environment and Water based in New Delhi. And so thank you very much for joining me. And I think we have some very diverse and different perspectives that we'll hear as we get into the topic. I think first what we're going to do is show the 3 videos from our panelists, though. So over to the videos.
Hello everyone, my name is Shalu Agarwal and I work with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. CEW is a non-for-profit policy research think tank which works towards impacting sustainable development at scale. The discourse on just transition is not new, but it is garnering more attention as the implications of a rapid energy transition becomes apparent for both the developed and developing countries. This is just a cartoon, one of the many under the Water on Earth series being produced by CEW, which showcases the tussle when it comes to meeting the net zero goals between the developing and developed nations. Who's pulling whose weight? But this is not just an inter-country issue, it's also an issue with various shades within countries. And context matters. I come from India, which is the 3rd largest energy consumer and emitter. Mainly because of its population size. India houses 18% of global population, which together accounts for only 6% of total primary energy use globally. And this is why, in per capita terms, Indians consume just a third of world's average energy use. And this is a reflection of India's stage in its development journey. Over the past 2 decades, nearly 800 million Indians got electrified for the first time, and yet a majority of them can only afford electricity use for lighting and basic purposes such as ceiling fan or watching television. As this graph shows, the use of more aspirational appliances like refrigerators or air conditioners remains very low. It also shows how the ownership of cars is less than 10%, which is almost multiple times lower than what you will observe in developed countries. These are examples to illustrate how the energy demand in India, and most developing countries for that matter, will and need to grow for the populations to realize a good quality of life, which in turn is underpinned by access to affordable and reliable energy supply. And as these countries transition towards a clean energy future, they are faced with the double challenge. How do they meet the rising energy demand while also decarbonizing the energy systems? Without doubt, the energy transition presents an opportunity as well as trade-off. The opportunity is the ability, or rather an opportunity, to leapfrog to a green infrastructure and not getting locked into assets which will become stranded in near future. But there are very significant trade-offs, such as the rising electricity cost or the job losses in coal-dependent regions. And these, of course, present themselves along with bottlenecks related to lack of finance, access to technology, or the affordability of both. And there is a lot of momentum towards clean energy transition across countries, but a lot of it is top-down and supply-focused. So the question is, how do we ensure a transition which is just as well as inclusive? In my view, first and foremost, a just transition has to be people-centric. It's about making alternate livelihoods, albeit improved ones, accessible to all. There's a lot of focus on mitigating the impact of coal phase out on communities living in coal-dependent areas across many countries, right? But an important question here is, are we developing solutions organically and collectively in partnership with those communities, or are we force-fitting the argument of job swapping from production of fossil fuel-based energy to a clean energy production? In many cases, the latter is not even an option. So, how can we think of new drivers of economic growth? And here I would like to give an example from CW's initiative, joint initiative with Wilcro, which is called Powering Livelihoods. This initiative aims to mainstream clean energy solutions for livelihood activities in India. As you see on the left, there are various DRE-powered productive use applications which are very contextual, which are rooted in the countryside demand for these services, be it cold chain refrigeration or sugarcane juicer, looms which are solar powered milking machines, and so on. And this is an example of creating livelihood opportunities that are demand-led and not just supply-driven. But the discourse on JT has to be broader, going beyond the focus on coal phase-out and supporting all those who may lose out in the energy transition. Which is why, in my view, JT also has to be technology agnostic and should support diverse economic transition trajectories. How can we do so? There are three ways to go about it. The first one is to enable access to finance for clean energy infrastructure, but also for transition fuels. Take this example. Millions of small and micro industries rely on fossil resources such as coal or oil and operate in price-sensitive markets. Now, in absence of economically viable alternatives, such as electric boilers, which could replace the coal-powered boilers, limiting the flow of capital or energy to such such MSMEs can put millions of livelihoods at risk, because this is the livelihood creation contribution that comes from MSME industries in many developing countries. So instead of leapfrogging from coal to electricity or green hydrogen, both of which present various challenges, enabling transition fuels such as access to gas for just hard to abate end users would be both fair as well as a rational approach to prevent a lock into an even more carbon intensive infrastructure. The second way to go to enable diverse economic transition is to further co-development of technologies which are critical to the transition. We need an ecosystem where developing countries can partner with developed countries in the process of technology development and not just be recipients of technology transfer. Be it battery or green hydrogen, we need to make sure that there is a collective ownership and collective development of these technologies and the ecosystem surrounding, such that it does not get concentrated into the hands of few, just like the fossil fuels, that is also part of a just transition. And finally, we need safety nets for those who are vulnerable to the transition risks. Even though the technology costs are falling, the energy poor of the world cannot wait until the technologies like storage become affordable for them, or the market becomes resilient to shocks. The recent energy crisis clearly underscores the importance of creating meaningful safety nets for vulnerable communities and actors. And for all of these to succeed, we need cooperation at international, national, and subnational levels. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Rob Macquarie. I'm a policy analyst and advisor at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. We're a multidisciplinary centre for policy-relevant research and training, and my own work focuses on climate finance and governance. I'm very pleased to be able to share some thoughts with you today on this important topic. I'll focus on the pivotal role of integrated policy and action across several levels, local through national to international, in mediating between environmental and social goals and achieving a just energy transition. So to begin, a reminder that we face multiple planetary boundaries, of which carbon emissions and a changing climate represent just one. And we're failing to stay within most of these limits. Global justice also demands that people are provided with certain fundamental rights and a sufficient standard of living. Assessing countries' actual performance against a framework to capture this, like the well-known donut developed by Kate Raworth, suggests that none of our existing systems are capable of delivering a just society in an environmentally safe way. So how do we navigate to a system that does? Well, as I'm sure we'll hear many times today, energy technology has improved very rapidly. In terms of falling costs, renewable electricity has consistently beaten analyst projections. But unpicking our deep economic, political, and social entanglement with fossil fuels will inevitably cause dislocation. And the energy system doesn't operate in a vacuum. New forms of energy generation require different raw materials, and a decarbonisation pathway that is attentive to social legitimacy and to planetary boundaries will create competing demands for land. So the just transition is an ethical imperative, but it is also a strategy. It represents the mode through which willing decision makers can create a strong foundation for durable change towards an economy in the safe operating space. I believe it can also help drive even faster innovation by reducing barriers and creating new connections between relevant agents. Now, 3 dimensions of justice are relevant for a socially and politically durable transition. The first kind is distributive, which tends to attract the most attention because it involves gain and loss. But next we also have procedural justice. That's how decisions are made and whether they are inclusive. Are there meaningful ways for people to participate in decisions that affect their futures? And finally, a just transition could also restore the status, rights, or well-being of groups that have been harmed in the past. So rather than diving into policies that would promote these different dimensions, I want to talk briefly about the governance and action needed to pursue all 3. National governments are of course at the crux of our existing system. They wield sovereign power over legislation, fiscal policy, and many other necessary tools to drive the transition and also to enshrine social rights. But they are frequently constrained and must delegate. Many need finance and capacity, and international partners, both public and private, can provide resources. That is also a question of distributive justice at a global scale. Inclusion and recognition, too, are enhanced by global agreements that set out rights and safeguards, and countries need a seat at the table to define these. At the other end, to respond to real needs and calls for justice, they must look to take their lead from and empower groups closer to the people within their jurisdiction. So those are city or regional governments, municipalities, and local and indigenous communities. Beyond that, I want to suggest that engaging with individuals and communities on their priorities for the sustainable transition could itself generate demand for the technologies and innovation that we know we need. So to close, I offer an example to illustrate. The voluntary carbon market offers the opportunity for finance to flow from richer countries where companies have committed to reach net zero emissions to activities around the world, especially in emerging markets and developing economies. And if done well, those activities can benefit nature, people, and make both more resilient. There are also discussions taking place to use carbon credit revenues to help bring coal plants offline early. Now, good markets are conditional on strong rules that are beyond what I can cover in this presentation, but perhaps we can get into in the discussion. But the important point is that this action has its source in the international system, filters through national laws and frameworks, and has local beneficiaries, the people affected by and carrying out activities. And there is potential across all three types of justice. Innovations will follow too, such as technology and ways of organising that enhance our stewardship of resources and facilitate changes to our energy systems. So in summary, this many-leveled approach is how we must think about action and governance for the energy transition, but also for land use and other environmental challenges, to deliver real innovation and justice as one package. And thank you for listening. I very much look forward to the discussion.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nan Wang. I'm from the MUFG Bank. Today, I'm happy to share our recent practice focusing on the energy transitions that are leaving nobody behind. A just and orderly transition is considered to be widely accepted by the global. There are 4 elements that need to be considered in order to achieve a just and orderly transitions. The first is about the social welfare, which means that it is important to strike a balance between social and economic development as well as the decarbonization of the economy. The second is about employment, which means that decent jobs are needed and the worker protections should be considered, especially focusing on the fossil fuel sectors and high emitting sectors. The third is about the decision-making process, which implies that people, especially the civil society, are needed to highly involved in the decision-making process of the climate policies. The fourth element is about cost distribution due to the penetration and deployment of new technologies. It is important that the cost should be bared equally and fairly. The first practice I would like to share today is about the Asian Transition Finance Study Group. This study group aims to provide practical guidelines for the transition finance with a special focus on Asia. We just released the Asian Transition Finance Guidelines in this September. In the guidelines, we emphasize the important factors to achieve a just and orderly transitions in Asia, which includes elements such as sustainability, reliability, affordability, as well as social stabilities. We further to expand the frameworks to evaluate the transition technologies based on these 4 elements. The second practice I would like to share today is the joint research on the long-term roadmaps of mitigation and adaptation for ASEAN countries. It is very important that to strike a balanced transition pathways within social and economic development as well as the decarbonizations. Thus, the integrated transition pathways for both mitigation and adaptations should be considered and prioritized for the strategic considerations in ASEAN countries. Here we present a sample image of the integrated transition pathways. Besides that, we also contribute to the decision makings of the climate policies. We plan to establish consortiums that includes the related stakeholders and civil societies in the policy makings. The schematic of the consortium is presented on the right side. The third practice I would like to share today is a research focusing on the energy poverty in Japan. Based on a nationwide household survey, we evaluated the energy poverty rate in Japan, which are presented on the left side of the on the left table. Depends on the evaluation methods. It is obvious that the energy poverty rate in Japan is within 6% to 20% in different regions. And we are also be able to develop methodologies to identify those households that are under the energy poverty. Considering about the recent soaring energy prices, it is necessary to implement special treatment on the households that are under energy poverty.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for those opening statements. And you know, the energy transition, as I said at the beginning, is vast, and I know that over the course of today and tomorrow, we'll be talking about how many different technologies are involved, how many different pathways are involved, the fact that it varies country by country, and by the way, it also needs to be just. So I think this is actually a very complicated topic in amongst a sort of wider challenge. And what I wanted to do, there seems to be a balance between a number of things we want to achieve on decarbonisation and then what a just transition means. And you've heard from those presentations, we're balancing growth, we're balancing energy security, we're balancing things like employment and social impacts, as well as between different countries, you know, developed and developing countries. So what I wanted to do was structure the conversation first around at a national level, what could be done, because I think really understanding you know, what's under the control of national governments. And then we'll move on to do international, which is a different set of challenges, and then maybe pick on some topics that have been raised by the panel members. So I wanted to start first actually with Shalu, actually, and really talking about growth and energy access, which is so important in a high growth developing market like India, but in many similar markets. I suppose my question is, how do you go about balancing that with decarbonisation? How do you go about thinking about that? And particularly, how do you make sure that it's just and it's fair, and as well as managing both growth and decarbonisation? Shalu.
Thank you, John. As you said, of course, this is a very complex matter and definitely not easy question for national governments to decide on. But we're already seeing many hopeful, or not hopeful, actually strong actions being taken by countries such as India as well, right? And I mean, in terms of action, we're already seeing a lot of the ambitions for this decade itself, being raised. A lot of development in terms of investing in renewable capacity or reducing the energy intensity of the economy. But as we all know, the growth rates of developing countries, they trump all the efforts that are being taken to reduce whether the energy intensity of the country's economic growth rate or the emissions intensity of the energy being used by the countries. And so even though these efforts are being taken and more and more is happening, the growth rates that these countries need to, they will foresee in the next 2 to 3 decades. India, for example, is looking at almost 7 to 8% of growth rate until 2050. I mean, on an average, if you were to model. And all of this implies that the emissions will have to rise in the near future, while you're, in absolute terms, while you're still, in terms of percentage, you're seeing results. And this is because, as I mentioned earlier as well, the development priorities are the most immediate, and countries, the national governments are answerable to their citizens to meet those aspirations, really, people aspiration. And of course, those aspirations are also set by what citizens of the country see is happening at the global platform also. So the conversation on how do we balance growth versus transition is not just about how do countries set their, or rather combine their developmental policies and they align them with the climate policies, but also how at the international level, what kind of standards of growth, what kind of developmental paradigm, what kind of consumption aspirations the global elites are setting. And of course, that's a separate conversation that we often don't have on, how the sustainable lifestyles or the sustainable consumption component of the SDG, goal 12. So that is one part of it. And in terms of how do we make this balancing just, I think it's important to talk about what is the just pace of transition. Of course, given the, growth aspirations, especially for the developing and emerging markets, the targets that are being discussed in terms of when the economies become net zero, they have to be also just. I mean, setting everyone for the same target of 2050 doesn't sound fair, from the global south perspective. And we need to, keep the climate justice and equity element here. Countries which have already peaked, for instance, they will require much lesser effort to decarbonize and bring the emissions down at a rapid pace over the next 2 decades, for instance, as compared to countries who are yet to peak and they need to actually grow their demand and then ultimately make that even stronger effort to come down to net zero. That's an example. So I think I'll keep my intervention brief, but when we talk about balancing, it has to be, of course, in the perspective on growth has to be there. And that really sets the context for how do we set the targets and what ambitions sound fair.
Great. So it sounds like growth is the sort of number one goal, and you have to keep developing and the economy growing. As much as possible of that would be clean growth. So you're building out new industries, but alongside that, keeping existing industries as much as you need it to keep the growth rate growing. So I suppose the quicker we can build out clean industries, the better in those growth markets. Thank you very much for that. Now, what I was going to do is ask Rob, the questions in some countries are a little bit different around justice, really around things like employment. So who's working in which sectors and what will happen to those sectors if employment's moved away, and also social levels in terms of the sort of, the base of the pyramid in terms of, social standing. Rob, do you just want to comment about what national governments can do around those two areas in particular?
Very happy to, thank you. So, I mean, the first priority would be to ensure that the connection between jobs and overall employment as a sort of site of justice concerns, and then climate strategies, the connection between those two needs to be made explicitly in terms of the governance at high level in national governments, because oftentimes we see that that's not the case, and many countries that have developed their NDCs, nationally determined contributions for how the commitments they'll make towards meeting the Paris goals, have yet to connect these issues at that high level, and oftentimes that it may be because of a lack of capacity and familiarity with these concepts, and there might be a need for external international support for them to do so. But speaking in general terms, that's really important to have that high level ownership of this entire agenda. If government departments are working in silos, then it's highly likely that there will be continued perceived trade-offs between employment objectives on the one hand and then decarbonisation on the other. Whereas, in fact, in many cases, with a holistic and joined up approach to thinking about this, governments can approach the labour market in a sort of determined way that projects forwards the opportunities that a green transition can really include. So that speaks to the second piece that's necessary, which is forecasting and anticipation. It's not possible to immediately match workers that might be in vulnerable industries to jobs today, because this is a dynamic process. The transition is going to take us many years. Action needs to be urgent. It needs to start happening now. But governments need to first turn to planning and analysis, so that they can identify which really are the firms and industries where workers are located, and the places where those people are located that are most vulnerable to stranding and finding themselves with diminished opportunities because of transitions. And then once that planning has been done, it's possible to think about which measures might be taken to help those workers themselves transition to new or somewhat different and gainful forms of good jobs. So an example would potentially be in France. I believe there's a joint ownership across the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry for Labour in an exercise to map skills necessary across the economy for in the context of the transition. Skills audits can also take place at company level, and so there's a potential to sort of do ground or bottom up assessments of this, and that speaks to a third principle for this overall objective, which is to engage downwards and do that straight from the get-go. So national governments can't do everything by themselves, as I was trying to stress in my presentation. And in particular, on this question of employment, the opportunities and risks will be very place-specific. And so there's a strong role for governments at the subnational level, so whether it's municipalities or city governments, but also for firms in really important industries to facilitate this planning process and to be a locus for increasing training and communication to workers. And of course, the workers themselves must be consulted, and must have more than consulted, must have active participation in this entire process. And so it has to be sort of engagement from the get-go, in the sense that for processes to be inclusive and, or to put it a different way, only inclusive processes are the ones that will actually end up with distributively just outcomes, because inclusive processes set the priorities that are shared. and that will actually benefit those who really need it. And so workers, whether it's through unions or perhaps organised in tandem with the employers, need to be brought into these discussions at an early stage. And finally, what I want to add is that it's important to think beyond just the workforce themselves in terms of this question of employment and justice, because often the people who might be most impacted by changes in employment circumstances might actually be sort of other members of the community beyond the immediate workers, in terms of people who are supported by people in communities who are supported by sort of workers in high carbon industries. And it's important that the sort of relationships between those and the different people in the community are also reflected. And we don't, for example, that having processes that sort of shut out those people could lead to replicating, in particular gender forms of injustice, for example, in some countries. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but hopefully that speaks to your question, John.
Yeah, and do you think have we seen this level of joined up thinking and connection between national, subnational and firms before? Is there a precedent for this kind of behavior, let's say, that we're expecting for the energy transition? Rob, can I just ask you as a follow-on question? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, getting to my mute button. There are some examples, particularly of countries that have moved away from their coal supply chains. Germany had some success with its attempts in some of the coal-intensive regions with broad-based sort of engagement across people there, people affected. And in the UK, for example, we see that the Welsh government has been deploying grants for training of workers in the steel industry, with a very large steel plant employing lots of people in certain concentrated geographically in certain parts of Wales. And so, and those grants go to both sort of general and technical skills for workers, and of course has to be leveled with information and advice as well. A final point to say on this note is that it's not, some of the facilitators of a just transition for workers may also not be obviously within the affected industry or in the workforce itself, but might be other enabling factors that would affect whether workers can actually access new opportunities. So there's a need for government to think about the transport system and other issues that would sort of affect people's ability to move or to commute to new locations. And I think that overall really holistic joined up way of approaching this is somewhat new in terms of to say that the examples we've seen before tend to be relatively targeted. And I think what's needed now is a step change to this being like a whole system consideration.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good point to make in that it is massive systems change, so a sort of more integrated way of thinking about it, a more integrated plan is essential. So Nan, let me turn to you. In your presentation, you mentioned thinking about, on the financial side, social welfare, employment, inclusive decision-making, sort of cost distributions. How well do you think the finance community really understands all of these dimensions that are important to the energy transition, and where do you think they are on the curve of sort of actually implementing those?
Thank you. And to start with, I think that it's very important to recognize that most financial institutes are already recognizing this kind of issue, especially focusing about the just transition, as most banks, as we already noticed, that joined the NZBA, Net Zero Banking Alliance, that has committed to decarbonize their portfolios before 2050. So I think that the basic logic about the private finance is that about handling risk and management of the risk. So I think that more and more financial experts are realizing and to get familiar with the climate risk and the transition, the risk associated with the transition, which is about like the uncertainty of the technologies and the uncertainty of the policies. So I think that the capacity building within the financial institute has been increasing, and more experts are joining the financial institute to contribute to the decision makings as well as the finance projects. From the perspective of financial institute, I think that two aspects are usually has to be addressed. The first is about the financing about the future technologies that contribute to the contributing to decarbonizations, which may include that accelerate the deployment of the new technologies. So from the perspective of just transitions, we have to think about when we accelerate the deployment of new technologies, it's actually lead to some kind of cost increasement of the whole systems. So how to to distribute these costs equally and fairly is most important issues when we consider about accelerating the deployment of new technologies. On the other hand, we also have to talk about what about the high emitting assets. For the high emitting assets, so that is lead to the discussion of how to manage the transitions of this kind of high emitting assets. So how to mitigate the negative impacts, such as the loss of jobs in this kind of high emitting sectors, and about the energy and security, and about social stability during the process of transit this kind of high emitting assets. So actually, the Asian Transition Finance Study Group that we released on this September is to provide practical guidelines to guide financial institutes to how to handle this, how to consider this kind of elements during their finance process. So how to integrate the idea of the affordability and social stability in their transition labeled financial products. That is the main thing of what we would like to achieve in the study group. And we find that how to balance this is a little bit difficult, especially for the local banks in ASEAN countries. And I think that during the process of just like 1 year discussion of learning about the recent trends and discussing about the internal scientific facts and how to manage the trade-off between these complex elements has been a very good help for the decision making of the local bank and improve their future decision making on their financial products. Thank you very much.
And as a little follow-on, do you think there's enough training and awareness across the financial system, or is more required?
I think that, thank you. And I think that it is ongoing quite a lot, and comparing with years ago, I think that the situation is improved quite a lot. But of course, as you mentioned, that the uncertainty is still huge, and we will definitely need more trainings as well as capacity building within the financial institute.
Okay, thank you. So Vikram, you've been waiting patiently. Are there any things at a national level that you think you would like to add to the comments that have been made, something that's maybe been overlooked or you'd like to really emphasize?
Thanks, John. I think the panelists have really brought into focus all the very important issues that we have to address to ensure that the transition does not leave anyone behind. I think there are 3 or 4 issues that we probably have to re-emphasize over and over again. It bears repetition. The first is that people talk of a trade-off between growth and sustainability. And there is a trade-off, but we have to internalize as governments or as society that countries that do not grow probably cannot afford decarbonization. But countries that fail to accept decarbonization as an imperative will not create sustainable growth. So there is, in that sense, no trade-off. They have to work together. The second point, and I think Shalu brought it out very well in emphasizing the importance of people-centric initiatives. We have to recognize that the less privileged, the disadvantaged, the poor have to be empowered to create their own destiny. We can't impose solutions onto them from above. The process of the energy transition must actually be a people-centric process, one that enables the community to reflect their own thoughts, their own challenges, and ensure that their views are integrated into the larger change process that the governments at every level are looking to institute. I think the third point, again, which has been brought out by Rob, is the issue of collaboration. This change is not going to be possible unless we all collaborate, whether it's governments with civic society, business, scientists. But collaboration, coordination is going to be key if we're going to ensure that technological change, economic transition, energy transition is indeed all-inclusive. And in that context, the fourth, I think, issue that I just want to re-emphasize is the issue of governance. One of the weaknesses that I find in all of these discussions is that we probably don't pay enough attention to the institutions that are responsible for change. And these institutions are at every level, international level, national level, subnational level. And frankly, we are seeing an erosion of institutions around the country, around the world. We're seeing a kind of a pulling back of our approach to issues that demand global interface, global interaction. We're seeing a resurgence of protectionism. And, you know, the Ukraine war is a great example of the major transformation that's taking place in the energy system. But the transformation is not necessarily a healthy transformation. It's fragmented the energy world, and we need to revive our focus, or sorry, not revive, but we need to refocus on the importance of creating institutions of governance that enable multilateralism, that enable collaboration. And final point, I guess I'd make again something that has been, you also have actually brought it out, John, and that at the end of the day, all of these issues requires a strategy. It cannot just be ad hoc. We need a real plan. We need a roadmap. We need a roadmap that will not only focus on technology and the changes that are required to bring about the transition, the technological changes that are required to bring about the transition. We need a roadmap, obviously, to ensure that the cost structures are competitive, because costs and affordability is key. But what we also need is a roadmap to ensure that people are able to acquire the skills to now work within this new energy system. There is going to be a massive transfer of skills required, a massive upgradation of skills. So training and skill development is going to be key. And finance, I mean, we need a whole new financial system. One of the big problems in India is that we can talk about the energy transition, and we have made some really substantive shifts towards a non-fossil fuel energy system. I mean, in terms of growth rates, not in terms of percentage shares. But we haven't done enough to create the necessary infrastructure to scale up the transition. And the financial requirements for creating the infrastructure are huge. So I think the financial strategy will have to be focused on. And then final point is that public awareness. I think a lot more has to be done to make people aware of the imperatives of decarbonization and of a clean energy system. I don't think the governments at any level are doing enough to bring home to people the importance of recognizing that this is not something that's just a geopolitical issue. It's affecting them right where they sit. So, John, sorry, my comments, but I just repeated some of the things that others had said.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I think the need for sort of integrated thinking, but also adding the people aspect into it seems to really jump out at me at many of those comments. So we talked a bit about the sort of national situation and what can be done. And we have mentioned a little bit about international. So Shala, you mentioned about the targets setting, the net zero target should be just. But I do want to return back to the international dimension because I think that's often one of the most challenging parts of what is just or what is not just. And so Shala, it would be great if you can just say how do you think people are thinking about particularly developed versus developing countries, and sort of what's fair in terms of the transition? You know, what's the perspective that you would take, and you know, the perspective you think people should really understand from the developed nations as they think about internationally and the developing markets themselves.
Hi, John. Thank you for the question, and thank you also, Mr. Mehta, for very nicely bringing together the key elements that we had discussed, and also adding to it the perspectives that we missed, and especially that people awareness part. On the question that John you've raised, how people in the developed countries could think about what the transition entails for others who are still developing. I think a little bit of it can, of course, I mean, these conversations add to it. I mean, we bring those perspectives, but also, trying to be proximate to the problem to see, what kind of, sort of on a daily basis, what kind of decisions are to be made. And Mr. Mehta said there are no real trade-offs probably at the macro level. But there are, I think there are trade-offs at the, at the implementation level, and then very real ones. I'll just give an example. Just last week, we were in a, meeting with a lot of stakeholders from different sectors, and we all participated in something very interesting, which was citizens' jury. So we all did a role play, and there were people who were playing the role of different stakeholders, some from rural areas or the countryside, some from urban, some donning the hat of policymakers or implementers, and some financiers or business people. And then there were experts sitting in front who came from different backgrounds, and a discussion on, okay, what kind of solutions work for everyone which is sitting in the jury. And because people, I mean, from a citizen perspective, they want everything here and now. At least, from people who are still trying to meet their ends meet, who have aspirations for growth, and having that next probably two-wheeler or a four-wheeler, their needs are here and now. Those who are building the systems, I mean, who come from the government background, they have to really balance those needs from the citizen and also plan for the future. Whereas experts like us, we are talking about the transition, often have a higher focus on the issues of transition, how we can secure the future. And what we discovered during that discussion was there needs to be a lot more conversation, not just within countries but across, so that we can understand and we can build consensus. I mean, all of us are right from the perspectives that we sit in, but to really see the transition through, from the citizen perspective, they need to be aware that, okay, the transition is not going to be as simple as they want, having, or rather, the developmental trajectory that people from, before them took. So that was just one example that I wanted to highlight. But I also think what some countries are doing, a lot of focus on data and integrated analysis to bring out what new drivers of growth can be, which can give confidence to people and, of course, the decision makers in, putting their faith in the transition. Something that Mr. Mehta also referred to, that, of course, the sustainable growth is only possible when we build new, it's an economic transition that we are talking about. And for instance, a lot of our work focuses on highlighting what are the jobs and growth opportunities from the transition that we entail. So for instance, I gave the example of livelihoods from distributed renewable powered applications, and that alone can unlock a $50 billion market in India. Similarly, replacement of something like just a ceiling fan in India could unlock a market of $12 billion because that's the size of industry and it's growing. But you're talking about just green products, highlighting the health benefits of transitioning away from polluting energy sources, and not just the transition perspective. So these are the elements of transition that really could appeal to people and to the decision makers. And even though the climate imperative is also very real for those in the developing countries, India is one of the seventh most risk-affected country from climate risk, and 75% districts in the country are they're exposed to drought and flood risk. So the problem is here and now, and I think through such data and analysis, that narrative can be taken to the people to build that social acceptance that these are the choices that we have to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And it seemed to be there was 2 points. One, so I like your story about citizen stories and sharing and being understood and getting consensus is about really sharing those different stories. So, and that breeds one is fairness. So it seemed to be that if you're understood, then you have a sense that maybe things can be fairer. And also, it also highlights the growth opportunities. So you were talking about, because of the discussions, the growth opportunities. And I know from our work, what we've found is growth opportunities are something that actually really engages people. So if they can see growth and they understand people, maybe they can do that in the growth in a fair way. So thank you for that. And Rob, you also mentioned connecting from national to international in your presentation. So it would be good to hear from you what you think the most important thing is for that international engagement, let's say effective international engagement. And as Vikram mentioned, things are becoming more fragmented and sort of less collaborative at an international level. So what would your thoughts be about how to bring that back in the right direction for the energy transition?
I'll try that. First of all, I'd just really love to echo what Shali was just saying about, and Vikram's comments on the trade-off, in that there isn't a trade-off between sustainability and growth overall at the macro level, because non-sustainable growth is an oxymoron, because we're at a stage now where even at a national level, continuing to be wedded to high carbon forms of production is just going to result in stranded assets and crises in actually quite short term. But the challenge is bringing that story into realization, into concrete terms, and implementing it, as Charlie said, and that's the real challenge here. And clearly, as your question alludes, John, the international system needs to help countries to achieve this to differing degrees, but also there are many actions that we really just need international coordination to even sort of achieve in good time. One area, for example, that we've been working on quite intensively over the summer at the Grantham Research Institute is on the recent proposals for so-called climate clubs, which are sort of being floated by prominently the German presidency of the G7, and could be a sort of new political intergovernmental forum for coordination, collaboration on climate. There are potential actions that sort of such an alliance could take to tackle some of the mounting trade concerns. We're seeing the European Union at the moment moving forwards with its proposals for a carbon border adjustment, which, it must be said, is a preferable policy stance to the previous stance that the EU took for the goal of reducing competitiveness concerns and carbon leakage from its emissions trading scheme. Its previous approach was to hand out free credits. And so stopping doing that and seeing a higher price for the credits prevail with the quid pro quo that things will be, that the carbon-intensive imports will have a charge at the border. That is preferable in terms of its alignment with Paris, but naturally creates greater tensions internationally. And so we've been developing proposals for how an alliance of countries, we prefer not to use the term club because it has exclusive connotations, but it should be an inclusive alliance of countries, could create a forum to sort of hash out these concerns at the same time as addressing issues of finance. I mean, it must be said very clearly that there's still a tremendous global injustice occurring in the lack of delivery of the finance flows that were promised from, in the language of Paris, developed to developing countries. And there would need to be sort of certainly some concessions from the richer countries on that point. But perhaps what they can, we see the potential club as or alliance as a space for that, for those discussions that would be linked to these implementation, really concrete sort of priorities rather than just a general commitment. It's about looking at industries that need to transition rapidly, looking at where the pressure points are for these questions of trade that are leading to difficulties and tensions. And finally, there could be another point that I want to echo Shali's is on the co-development of technology. We see the alliances could be a space for countries to chart roadmaps for particularly the hard-to-abate, highly emissions-intensive but trade-exposed industries, so steel and cement and chemicals, and take aligned policy actions to advance those. So that could be setting common goals, but also using green public procurement to buy low carbon goods, and an R&D and technology innovation financing component. Now, all of this is quite a big ask of a currently very fragmented and increasingly fraught geopolitical space. What I think we have to continue to promote is the opportunity that collaboration on this one issue, which in fact is many issues, it's a huge cluster of issues, but the climate considered as this one forefront issue. The collaboration in that space could then bleed out into other areas and in a positive way and result in reinforcing collaboration in other areas. I think another thing I just want to make sure I mention would be the pivotal role of international financial institutions and their sort of ability to amplify efforts at the national level. There is the potential for not only financing but also sort of significant technical and capacity support from these institutions, which can be, so I'm thinking of the multilateral development banks in particular. There is a huge multiplier in terms of using them as a mechanism for finance for countries to deliver finance to recipient countries, but the technical support and technical assistance and capacity support, can help governments that are coming very new to all of this agenda that we've been discussing, to put in place the governance frameworks, to put in place the transparency and accountability frameworks, to create the fora where they involve subnational and local stakeholders, to do the forward planning and the analysis that they need to do to be able to create coherent jobs and community redevelopment strategies. For me, that's the real priority, is to see that the international support system that does exist start to say, okay, we're going to scale up the level of support. We're also going to do it in a way that really just enables these transformational agenda-setting actions by countries, and recognizing the scale that is necessary to do that. Ultimately, yeah, that's the only, for me, one of the only ways that the resources available at international level can be channeled through. And so that's why in my presentation I was trying to develop this idea that national governments are the sort of pivotal point that, for that relationship, but actually they need to sort of take all the priorities from the lower level, which is where implementation really matters, and as other participants have said, where what really connects with people is the sort of opportunities in their area, in their lives. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And great you brought up the sort of concept of climate clubs and maybe coordination around specific opportunities is the way to go. I know we have seen more and more bilateral discussions. So rather than a sort of a one number north-south, which is tough to actually realize, basically engaging different countries in bilateral discussions around growth opportunities, because actually, you know, all countries are looking for good business partners and economic growth. We're actually getting close to time now, so I'm actually going to run across the screens for a final comment, actually, around sort of maybe one key message. We've talked a lot about national, we've talked a lot about international, we've touched on many aspects of how to define just. Maybe, Nan, I can start with you. What would your message be if we had to remember one thing around the leaving nobody behind? What would that be?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the final message I would like to say here is that the Finance Institute has already realized and emphasized the importance of just and transition in the overall decarbonization energy transitions. So the important thing is that, of course, finances will play a very important role in the general transition process, and the massive investment on the infrastructures and sector. So, but the most important thing during this process, I think that during these discussions, we have already recognized that the collaborations between the Finance Institute as well as the governments and as the stakeholders, and the most importantly, and the people-centered transition that to incorporate people and civil society during the process of the decision-making and other actual finance activities.
Okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you. So finance is on board and wants to be collaborative across those different stakeholder groups. Thank you. Shalu.
I just want to say that, in the past, there have been many transformations, but, and most of them haven't been just, there have been elements of, lack of equity and lack of distributive justice. But this is our opportunity, that as a global community, we can use the language of trust, cooperation, and empowerment to ensure that the transition is people-centric indeed. And we need more institutions and more people who are working with governments and communities in co-defining roadmaps for transition that take all perspectives together. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we have an opportunity to be different this time, and a lot more people-centric. That seems to be a phrase that sticks well. Rob, final comment.
Thank you. Great thoughts. I would say I think we need to just create dedicated spaces for people to talk now, and as Charlie just said, co-defining pathways. That's at the local level and even the national level. A climate assembly can be transformative in terms of what the people who participate in it get out of their sort of improved understanding of the way forwards, and then how that sort of disseminates through the rest of society and can change the debate. But then at the international level as well, resolving some of these issues, these perceived trade-offs, these exchanges and blocks, there need to be fora to get to work on the solutions and to understand what could really be perceived as mutual benefit.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a point well made in terms of often fairness is through lack of understanding or lack of communication. So that's a great thing. So Vikram, final thoughts from yourself.
It's been a great discussion, John, and thank you for moderating it so effectively. I guess the one thought that runs through my mind whenever I have a conversation on this subject is the disconnect between the achievements of the international community, whether it's the international multilaterals, whether it's the developed world, in managing and meeting the expectations of the large population, low per capita income, high carbon emission countries like India. And the fact that there is this disconnect has complicated the task of these governments like India in managing this trade-off. I go back, okay, the micro trade-offs, they recognize that there may be no macro trade-off, but there are indeed, as Shalu and Rob have reminded us, major micro trade-offs. And we cannot, governments here are facing an increasing challenge because the commitments of the international community have not been met. So the 2 points I'd make here. One is that really the pressure on the world outside to deliver on those commitments must be intensified. And the second is that we cannot rely on politicians and political leaders alone to deliver on the challenges. So society has to come together, civic society, private sector, business, technologists, scientists, and so on, have to come together to actually work on the solutions that we are talking about. How do we ensure that we make the transition without leaving anyone behind?
Fantastic, and a great summary. And I think, yeah, collaboration is probably, if we, the watchword, communication and collaboration. So I'd just like to say, if you could join me in thanking my panel, that would be great. Thank you very much.